Hi there, thank you very much. And was lunch good?
Yes. Excellent.
Not too good, hopefully, because it's always that horrible feeling when you're doing something just after lunch, and it's quite dark in here as well, so I will walk up to that end of the room occasionally just to check whether people are still with us. But so as Steve said, the question mark is deliberate, and if any of you have seen me speak before, I tend to start off by just querying words and what we mean by words. And in this case, both of them, I think, are slightly problematic. I always worry a bit about our use of the word digital, because it invariably means other. You know, we have people who do digital. It's not real, it's not the day job, it's not whatever. Or even the continuing attitude that I get all the time, oh, I don't do technology. As if it was something separate that we could choose to ignore. Whereas for me, just it's increasingly life. It's just how things happen. And to possibly a worrying degree, in the sense that I'm not normal. We were just talking about the fact that my book was called Organizations Don't Tweet, People Do. And because I have to write that so frequently, I set up a text shorthand on my computer so that I type ODT and it auto-completes the whole title. I find myself now in conversation with people, if I go to say, organizations don't tweet, people do, my brain thinks ODT and expects my mouth to auto-complete it. So it's that sort of, and you know, we were just chatting about it, I've got friends who've got chips implanted in their arms. And I'll talk a bit later about the way technology is just becoming so blurred in terms of life and the way we live our lives and the physical spaces that we inhabit, that I think that's already the case for many of us. But the word transformation gets bandied around. And you know, frankly, having consulted for a lot of big organizations, most of them don't really want transformation. They want tinkering. They want moving deck chairs on the Titanic rather than transformation. And so when Don, it was actually, who used this quote in the blurb for this talk, and I read 70% of organizations already underway with their digital transformation of learning, I thought, So at that point I was just going to ask, and maybe with Steve's help, just those of you here in the room today, do you feel that 75% or 70% rather of the organizations are already underway with digital transformation? How many of you think yes? Okay, so those of you who said yes, if I can pick on you, what would it mean to you?
Do you mean the organisation that I work for?
Yes, your experience of digital transformation as it currently stands.
I think a lot of it is to do with, for an organisation, digital can be convenient. So you can, for an L&D department, you can hire less staff, you can spend less money, and you can have digital solutions which are kind of perhaps a one-off cost, but answer a lot of what HR perhaps consider to be some of the problems.
So to dig further into it, digital means?
Online resource and solution rather than sitting in a classroom with somebody talking, because that person talking is expensive. Okay, that time is expensive. That classroom is one event which then would need to be repeated. Okay. So I think for our organisation, it's definitely a cost saving. Okay. Whether that's a transformation or whether it's a sort of cheap replacement, that's the question, isn't it?
Because yes, I mean, it's talking about learning within organizations, but I think many organizations will also be saying they're facing or anticipating or trying to achieve digital transformation. So it's not just within the learning function. Somebody else who said yes to the... Nigel?
I think the three interesting words are already, underway and there. Already underway doesn't mean you've got there.
Yeah.
And there, digital transformation doesn't mean you would look at it and say, that is a model of how it should be done. Yeah. But I can't think, I'm actually surprised it's only 70%. I think virtually everyone is underway, not many people have completed, and how their digital transformation compares with what I might understand as digital transformation can be very, very different. So that sentence kind of masks a whole bunch of interesting contradictions.
Which we're going to dig into a bit. And anybody else, just before I sort of respond a bit to that? Chap at the back there? No. Sorry, Steve, just on the right. Ladies coming towards you.
So I think a few people have got digital transformation confused with digitization. So I think, in organizations in the past, we've digitized content and classroom materials, but it doesn't mean it's, digital transformation where you'd probably describe it.
So I was asked to speak at, I think it might have been Henley Business School, about digitization. And it's really funny because to me, having come from a television background and video editing background, digitization means converting from analog formats into digital formats, And this was about digitization of people, which I found a slightly uncomfortable concept. But it's even having made the comments about my own digitization. But to pick up on Nigel's comments as well there, this also fascinates me that I was listening to a podcast on the way in this morning with Jack Dorsey, CEO of Twitter. And just thinking how long ago it is since those of us who were early in Twitter adopting the @ symbol and the hashtag and all those sorts of things. And yet people still, organizations particularly, still struggle with the unpredictability and the unmanageability of Twitter. So the sort of things that I'm going to talk about here are, I think, those social consequences, the interpersonal consequences of the technology, rather than anything to do with digitization or the system itself. And also about how you persuade people to get involved in this or to feel comfortable with it, because it's quite a big shift. And use of the phrase digital transformation is what I've begun to call thingification. It gets turned into a thing that gets done to you. It's a bit like all those other things, like social media became a thing, and a thing that could be sold. And I often think there's watching around the floor downstairs with all the technologies, how you've basically, in very many cases, got the same systems just relabeled with different labels. I used to be involved in knowledge management, and that was the same systems that were data management or information management or whatever else. And so this sort of, it almost makes it comfortable that we can talk about this thing called digital transformation. But to go into a little bit about it, and I know some of the other speakers in the conference have talked about this in more detail, but the broad gist of digital in the context of the workplace is around a number of things. And so to start with artificial intelligence and automation. Again, even the phrase artificial intelligence is problematic because 9 times out of 10 people actually mean machine learning, which is a much more prosaic, boring, frankly, topic. Somebody said the other day there, if it's being called machine learning, it's probably from somebody who knows what they're talking about. If it's called AI, it's probably a keynote somewhere. Because it sounds more sexy and more glamorous. But clearly, as more of our lives become digital, the ability for machines to watch what we do and learn from it is increasing at a rate of knots. And all sorts of machines. So even on my iPad, my handwriting is atrocious, but I now have a system called GoodNotes that not only recognizes my handwriting and convert it into copyable text, but it will find words within thousands and thousands of notes instantly. And that's partly because that algorithm, that AI, is picking up on the messiness of my handwriting and realizing that I mean the word AI or digital when I write that scrawl. So even at a personal level, in terms of Siri and the other technologies that I use, it's already beginning to have its impact. But once you have access to the accumulated knowledge of a whole organization or institution, where the machines can just trundle across vast data sets, then their ability to understand begins to increase exponentially. Now, I know there's a lot of writing at the moment, Yuval Harari and these other people are writing about the future of technology where it begins to replicate or challenge human nature, human consciousness. So I find myself reading more and more these days about what is human consciousness, what is it that makes us uniquely different, what allows us to stay ahead of the robots. And we're not very clear about that. And I think it's something that I'll come back to later, that as a learning element within an organization, you perhaps have a greater responsibility in trying to understand what it is that makes the human element of a business the unique and differential part of that organisation. But automation, again, clearly is going to start to creep in. I made that trivial comparison with my brain expecting to think ODT and have it autocomplete. Likewise, I don't know how many of you use Grammarly, but when I'm using my computer to write anything, I parse it with Grammarly, which comes back and suggests not just spelling mistakes or blatant grammar mistakes, but nice points of how to write better. And I'm quite happy for it to help me with that. It's not intrusive, it's not that stupid paperclip thing that used to annoy us all that we turned off. It's at my control and it's helping me to get better. But again, I can imagine all sorts of scenarios where that begins to be much more part of people's working lives and at the point of doing the work. So recently, I took the unusual step of getting my Class 1 heavy goods vehicle license. So believe it or not, and this might worry some of you, I'm now licensed to drive large articulated trucks around the UK road system. But I've got a huge learning curve. It's really outside my comfort zone, and I'm having to learn all sorts of stuff. But the beginning of my day is a quarter of an hour or half an hour vehicle check. Then I have to go around and check various things about the safety of the vehicle. And so I'm beginning to build on my phone little automated checklists that remind me. So the day before, if my diary picks up the fact that I've got HGV in the commitment title, it will automatically prompt me with this list of things that I have to remember to check when I get to the vehicle. Or things like even my watch. So I have to-do lists, and one of those lists is errands. So when my watch knows that it's within distance of the local DIY shop, it vibrates and reminds me that I need to pick up some things because I'm in the area. So again, these are all personal ways that I'm beginning to use automation and AI at its very basic form in order to help me to do things that, to me, are a very steep learning curve for me. But again, talking to somebody earlier, that I know this is a topic that's come up in the conference, that thing about delivery of micro-learning. A long way away from the courses that you were saying people are trying to save money by not delivering. Even the idea of a course, however delivered. So about 10 years ago, I got involved with the Open University, pre what became known as Social Learn, where they were trying to work out how to deliver learning to people on the internet. And I was saying that I don't want to even go to a virtual university, because let's face it, most of the online learning spaces are still sort of emulating conceptually a physical learning space. And I said, I don't want to come to your place to carry on my learning. I want you to come to my place, because my place is the internet, and I'm learning all the time on the internet. And if your primary function as a university is to accredit me for having learned stuff, I want you to come and accredit me where I'm doing it, not having to go to somewhere special. So again, I think that's a fundamental element of some of this, that even if we build digital systems, we're still conceptually thinking of it as a training context, where we're dispensing content at people. And at the Fishbowl event Nigel and I were at the other day, somebody used the phrase about giving up control. And I'm afraid I nearly snorted, because I thought, control of what? You've already lost control. You haven't had control of people's learning since the internet started. But people still act as if they did. Once we get into this world of algorithmically driven stuff, we get into what I call the ideology of algorithms. And this is something that increasingly deeply concerns me. So I wrote an article about this recently, but I was saying that, frankly, somebody said if you want to murder somebody and get away with it, put the body on the second page of Google search results, because nobody will ever find it. The degree to which what we think is the truth, what we think is happening in the world, what we believe and what we act on, is being determined through Facebook or Google or LinkedIn algorithms by a very small group of ADD geeks in California. And we're basically allowing them to determine the future direction of civilization, while the rest of the world stands back and goes, oh, I don't do technology. Well, technology's doing you at the moment. And I feel passionately, back to Nigel's comment, that 70% of people might have digitized their courses, but they've not rolled their sleeves up and got deep into the fact and the consequences of the fact that we are living a life that's increasingly digitally steered and that is largely out of our control. And the other thing I increasingly encounter is people making assumptions about what will be digitized and what won't. So again, going back to the driving thing, when I say that I'm taking up this new career, parallel career, people think, well, that'll be automated, as if it was going to happen in the next year. But people who think that, A, don't understand how complicated or how fallible the technology is at the moment. Somebody was saying this the other day, that self-driving cars mostly still rely on an adequate mobile signal. And if you just think how many times you lose your mobile signal when you're driving around the UK's road system, and you then transfer that to automated cars that are driving themselves, that's a worrying thought. But equally, the people who assume it will happen have never driven a big truck through central London like I have. And I'm not going to be on the roads if an automated truck is trying to do that. So I think, again, there's a naivety about the challenges of it, but equally of what classes of jobs get automated. So I was speaking at a conference in Sydney about the workplace and the workplace of the future and our expectations of workplaces and what would make an effective workplace. And I had just been at HR Tech, which happens in this same building at the far end there every year. And there have been many vendors showing chatbots in the context of HR. So you'll have come across chatbots yourselves, increasingly in a help desk situation. You get a little thing that you can click on and you'll have some interaction, some of it with a person, some of it with a bot. And getting increasingly sophisticated and satisfying to us to interact with. And the HR ones, rather than trying to find some document that might or might not answer your question or trying to get hold of somebody in a call center, interacting with a chatbot that navigates you to the answer to your problem is very powerful. Likewise, in a training context, you can imagine all sorts of uses for them. So with this audience in Sydney, it was about 60 people, I slightly mischievously said, okay, how many of you would prefer on a daily basis to interact with a chatbot than with your current line manager? And more than half the room put their hands up, which, as somebody subsequently said, is more of a comment on management than it is on technology. But again, I'm mentioning it just to provoke what we're comfortable with and what we think is necessary and what we think is value. So some of the people who currently think they add value, maybe not once we have alternative systems. You know, I was talking to somebody about the banking industry this morning and the fact that I use Monzo, which some of you might have come across as a banking app. And I was talking to a friend of mine who works in banking who was all stiffy and dismissive of Monzo, and it's not this, and it's not that, and it's not the next thing. And I've actually said, you know, frankly, I don't care. It does what I want it to do. It manages my finances, and it's almost fun to use. So all the kind of institutional status and the kind of background and the degrees that they all, I don't care. If I can click a button and something happens, I'll do it. And also I thought I'd mention and show you, some of you may have come across WUSA. So this is a chatbot system that's aimed at helping people with depression or anxiety or various challenging psychological situations who may not have access to other forms of support. And this was me just logging into WUSA to play with it and see how it felt. And it's actually beginning to get a lot of traction. And this comes back to something else that came up in conversation about Twitter this morning, about how people still can be very dismissive of technology. It's not real. It's not real relationships. And the number of times I get people saying to me, oh, you know, face-to-face is the best form of human communication. Frankly, I've had some pretty disappointing face-to-face experiences over the years. I've also had incredible online experiences. I've got friends, real friends, who I've known for 18 years through blogging, who I've never met. And I think that the intimacy, you know, in some ways a text communication just goes straight into your neural network. It feels like an extended neural network. And for intimate things, challenging things, personal things like your psychological well-being, it's just interesting how much more comfortable sometimes that can feel than being faced with sitting in front of a psychologist or somebody with status or somebody who's wearing the uniform and makes me, you know, there's a whole bunch of mechanics around face-to-face that are problematic, that online are different and not always worse. So again, in terms of learning, so going back to the thing about consciousness, and I said I'm getting interested in consciousness, reading about Buddhist philosophy and reading about non-duality and the way that we create our own sense of self through our own language and our separation. So I've signed up to a website around non-duality and trying to explore that topic and understand it better myself. That's an interaction with somebody. Because I want that stretch. I want to do more than just read a book. I want to make myself feel uncomfortable around that topic. So again, the reason I'm touching on all these things, and it'll come clearer hopefully at the end, is that if all we're doing is digitizing systems to send facts in people's direction, that's a dodgy future. You know, facts are 10 a penny. Some of the understanding that we're going to have to adopt, behaviour changes we're going to have to adopt, are much more challenging. So the reason I've got blockchain up there, and just to clarify, blockchain is, you know, the distributed, encrypted ledger that is such a thing at the moment. Talk about thingification. Blockchain is definitely suffering from that. And the cryptocurrencies have gained the visibility. So everybody knows about Bitcoin and all those sort of things. But actually for me, it's the smart contract side of blockchain, the Ethereum side of blockchain that's much more interesting, which is a mechanism for allowing a network of people to accredit each other, to be able to recognize skills in each other, to certify skills in each other, to record transactions of skills or ideas between each other. And one of the interesting examples, which sadly failed, but there was a chap who, you know, Uber obviously disintermediated the taxi companies and just connected the taxi drivers, well, through Uber with the punters. This guy set up a competitor to Uber based on a blockchain owned by the taxi drivers. So they disintermediated Uber. They took Uber out the middle. So again, I think this is really interesting, back to the guy at the breakfast who talked about having control. You know, blockchain potentially enables a decentralization and a disintermediation of currently centrally mediated things like universities, like publishing, like banking with the cryptocurrencies. So on holiday, we had a friend who's an accountant who was sort of very concerned about Bitcoin. He said, oh, it's not real money. And I said, well, none of it's real money. You know, since the demise of the gold standard, they're all making it up. And it just depends on who we trust to make it up. Do we trust a bunch of guys in the city in suits, or do we trust a large enough network of ourselves who've got a mechanism to distribute that trust more effectively? So again, I think very pertinent to training and learning and delivery of services. Not least because another aspect of the blockchain that's tantalizingly close is something that's been around since the early days of the internet and the early days of blogging, is micropayments. You know, one of the reasons that journalism maintained its kind of stranglehold on news was the fact that they had a mechanism, albeit a fallible one, for making money out of it. And individual bloggers or individual journalists have always struggled to get enough traction, enough money to be able to make it a viable thing, because the mechanisms for charging for it were too cumbersome and people didn't want to do it. But a blockchain could potentially enable people to do micropayments of value to each other who've conferred or passed on knowledge. So I'm actually involved in a startup in Melbourne, or peripherally, and the guy who'd started it his wife's had a baby, so he's got distracted recently. But the idea was, it's called Now Curate, and the idea was to do LinkedIn better. So to actually be a place where people could curate their professional experience and their knowledge and make it accessible to other people. And we were talking about building it on a blockchain, so that from the beginning we can record transactions and value where people have passed things from one another in this sort of context. And it's where I kind of end up with all this stuff, going back to the original statement and the thingification and the fact that many of us think it's about digitizing our resources or our systems. Paradoxically, for me, digital transformation is about people. And it's about unleashing the skills and the abilities of people, which have been sort of largely closed up and kept constrained. And it's about changing expectations. So when I was asked to do a video, as we all were, all the speakers were asked to do sort of little videos explaining what our session was going to be about, I sort of started off trying to do it in my office at home and trying to make it look like an office, you know, making sure I had the right books on the bookshelf behind me to make it look sort of, you know, professional. And then I thought, well, no, actually, I do my best work when I'm out on my local walk, which, as you can see, when I filmed, it was during that last heavy snow that we had out in the Chilterns. But that's where I think best. That's where I have the best idea, if not on my truck. So the other thing about the truck is that when I'm sitting there listening to podcasts, driving up and down the motorways of the UK, I use my watch all the time. Because something will occur to me, and I'll just pick my watch up and dictate it to Siri, and I've captured it, ready for when I get back into the office. So the reason I was using that was to sort of just push the fact, especially in the context of workplaces, I don't need a workplace anymore. But even if I do, this is my office at home, and as you can see, all of it is literally can be taken away in my pocket. So I can reconstruct. So effectively, my iPad has become my desktop. So I don't use my big computer unless I'm video editing or something like that. So that's become my desktop, but it spends most of its time on the desk, okay? My phone has become my laptop because when I travel, I take a very small, much smaller Bluetooth keyboard with me, and I can write even long-form essays and stuff on my phone. And my watch has become my mobile device. So I'm increasingly just leaving the phone at home and relying on the watch. So again, the reason I'm mentioning all of this is we still have an institutional computing desktop, people talking about CMSs and things like that. But for me, that's learning. That's where I learn. That's where it could be a cafe, it could be a Starbucks. And so that is also, we see this in shadow IT as it's become known. And this is, again, a big challenge in corporate life, where IT departments still nostalgically and romantically cling to their idea of a firewall. When I ask people about Facebook or whatever, we banned Facebook at work. And I said, well, do you take people's mobile phones from them? No, we don't do that. Well, you haven't banned anything then, And it's that sense of a rigid perimeter that we have certain behaviors inside and certain behaviors outside. And this network, using our own consumer devices, has become known as shadow IT because we're taking that control into our own hands, literally. And I think it's being mirrored by what I'm beginning to call shadow learning. The fact that I can, and it happened even the other day at that breakfast thing I was talking about, where I was sitting next to somebody who was using an iPad, using GoodNotes, which I mentioned earlier that I use, but she was using the previous version. So I just learned across and said, have you seen the new version of this? It does this and it does that, it does the next. Oh, I didn't know that. She's taking it up. I said, this is it. This is learning happening literally now with us just saying, have you seen this? Can you look at this? And because most of you will now be doing this all the time on the internet, looking up YouTube videos to know how to fix the lights on the back of your car, And this has been possible for nearly 20 years. But we still struggle with that institutionally. We still stop people doing that. I had a friend who was doing a comms survey for a big corporation to improve communication. And the first thing she did was go out and try and find out what they were doing. Found a sizable group on Facebook where staff were, in a secure context, sharing how to do their jobs better. Thought the people who'd commissioned the survey would be delighted. And when she told them, they closed it down because they're not allowed to use Facebook at work. Or equally, I was talking to a financial group in Jardine Matheson in Hong Kong, highly regulated industry, and the board slightly self-consciously came up and confessed to me that they were using WhatsApp to talk to each other because they got so fed up waiting for the IT department to give them a secure, managed service. So again, I think that shift is paralleled in terms of learning, that people are beginning to do it for themselves. And they're doing it through networks of autonomous individuals. And this goes back to the early days of blogging when we all had a blog role where you would make visible the people that you trusted, the people that you read, the people that you rated. And that's sort of fallen by the wayside, and the mechanics of Facebook or LinkedIn haven't really replaced it. But that thing about being seen to be credible, being seen to be knowledgeable, being seen to be willing to share. I was talking to a friend in Australia last night, Rita Zonius, who was being asked by some corporate type she was trying to talk to about social sharing and social learning. They were sort of asking, what's in it for me? What's the immediate payback? And they struggled with the concept that most of us have discovered, that if you continually keep pushing stuff out and being willing to share, it comes back to you, sometimes multiplied, but you never know where or when. So again, that's counterintuitive, but key to some of these networks. And it's the fact that it's at the edges. So Stowe Boyd, many moons ago, coined the phrase edgelings, which stuck. So the people that engage with this, embrace this, and find value in this sort of way of looking at the world in the first instance, certainly, tend to be marginal. They're at the edges of organizations. They're struggling with coping with the structures and the constraints and the boundaries of organizations. But actually what Stowe was pointing out was that we are all becoming edgelings. You know, we're all at the edge of our networks with our mobile devices, and the middle is becoming less necessary. It's becoming questionable, it's becoming debatable. So going back to the Open University, that role of accreditation clearly still has value. But the feeling of having to go somewhere and listen and sit in front of us, you're unfortunately having to do now with me, listen to a particular person speaking is less and less the case. So, where are we sort of heading with all this? And I think this is, it's an understatement. You know, sort of going back to my problems with the word digital, we still think of digital as meaning computers, as meaning IT, as meaning CMSs, learning systems, blah, blah, blah. I think it's heading in a very different direction. It's wearables, it's intimate. We were again talking about people with chips. It's distributed. How it's managed is going to have to change, so you're going to have to enable that distribution rather than get in the way of it. Speed it up and learn how to deal with it rather than try to constrain it. And that will take a different style of management. And again, you hear of all sorts of exciting and optimistic and positive initiatives getting squandered because the prevailing managerial attitude is still control. They still see themselves as gatekeepers, stopping the whole world falling apart or their staff running amok. And I used to get this all the time talking to people about social networks. Oh, well, what happens if they all start wasting their time or they start talking about us in public or whatever else? And my first question was always, who employed these morons in the first place? You know, you're employing smart, intelligent, thoughtful people, and then you're treating them as if they've got no ability to make decisions for themselves. So I think there's associated with all of this, a fundamental shift in management. But I think, and this is where I think it's beginning to get into the stuff that I feel people need help with, is it's a different mindset. So in society generally, and in organizational life, we've sort of trained people to be complacent, compliant consumers. You know, don't rock the boat too much, don't ask too many awkward questions, just do stuff. But those are the very behaviors that will make you at greatest risk of being automated by a bot. You know, in contrast, the things that would have made you a troublemaker, wasting your time thinking. You know, I still see presenteeism all the time in organizations. Well, if I can't see them, I don't know they're working. And I remember a BBC situation where somebody who was a researcher was told off for wasting time reading the newspaper. I'm a researcher. But it was just that perception of wasting time and that the need to control it. So most organizations will struggle to unleash, and again we use these phrases, the power of the people that work for them, but it will take a different mindset. And we have different needs in terms of staying ahead of the robots. So I would sort of anticipate that if not now, not maybe 5, 10 years, the job of training will be to encourage the sorts of thinking I'm talking about, will be to enable the sorts of networks that I'm talking about. Might be to take away some of the roadblocks that are prevent. So a lot of this is not about making something happening, it's allowing something to happen that's trying to happen anyway. So I think the role of a good manager is to facilitate this process, to remove blocks, to sanction behaviors that at the moment seem problematic, to stand up. So, you know, I know a lot of HR people, learning people, whatever, get frustrated at not being at the top table, as they say, not being taken seriously in the organizational context, as just being seen delivering training or skills or whatever. But I think, and I'm seeing more and more boards really struggling with some of the stuff that I've just been talking about. They have no real idea how to deal with it. And I think it could be a compelling offer if training stood up and said, you know what, we can help with this. We can train people, we can help people to engage with this, to embrace this, to be brave enough to start acting differently and help you as an organization to deal with it. And this is where I think the word transformational actually does come in, because it's transforming individuals. It's helping people who've right through school, university, early careers have been trained basically to be wage slaves. It's helping, and I genuinely worry about this, you know, because in 20 years' time, this revolution will have impacted the white-collar knowledge work population. All the people that I sit with on the tube when I make the mistake of coming in at rush hour, going in like Canary Wharf this morning, you know, when they all got off at Canary Wharf to go into their glass and steel nightmares. And I find myself thinking, what are we going to do with you all? in 20 years' time? Because you can't all be entrepreneurial. And I mean, we might, as with many technology revolutions, discover whole rafts of things we didn't know we needed. And there might be a whole raft of jobs that we don't anticipate or can't even imagine now that fill that space. But if not, we're going to have some real challenges with what to do with those people. And we're going to have to face that discomfort. And again, I think this could be a role, a responsibility for learning. Is learning about ourselves, learning about what feels uncomfortable. Why does it feel uncomfortable? Why is nobody talking about this? How can we get people to talk about this? And at the moment, this is one of my sort of tweet type one-liners, but it's easier to digitize our discomforts than to deal with, or dysfunctions than to deal with them. So at the moment I see people thinking, oh yes, we'll just spend £100,000 on some new CMS or some new system or some new distributed blah blah. And this happens in the IT departments as well, it happens in the marketing departments, it happens in the comms departments particularly. Because it's easier to do that. Because you can get busy, you can have a big project, you can have Gantt charts, you can do all the stuff that comes with that. But actually your problem is much, much more intimate than that. It's distributed, it's unpredictable, it's an ecosystem. It's lots of little pieces. So again, that instinct to tidy it up and make it centralized, because that's easier, is in the opposite. So, you know, I think for us to stay ahead of the robots, we need to think harder, to be more honest about things. You know, why is this not working? Why is it difficult? Why is it causing us discomfort? To share that better. And by that, I mean just be more robust about it. Have that internal blog post or that internal conversation on your internal social networks, which I hope you all have. Or at the very best, just at least have a coffee over the subject. But just begin to broach some of this stuff. And talk more. You know, my blog's called The Obvious because it was me overcoming my reticence about stating the obvious, which I still suffer from dreadfully. Every time I write a blog post, I think, why am I doing it? Who's going to read this? And some of the people who read it think, why is he writing? But it's that sort of very British nervousness about just saying it. Because you think, oh, everybody must know this. It must be really obvious. It's too simple for people not to have already thought about it. And of course, those are the things that come back and bite you in the bum. Because those invariably are the big things. So again, just going back into what to do about this, and I'll ask Steve maybe to help me with some of this in a moment, but just how to bring about behaviour change. How to help people to change their behaviours. And a lot of this is around changing your own behaviours. You know, it's about walking the talk. I mean, I remember with some big corporate clients where they put in some blogging system and I would go back a few years later and say, how's it going? How's the blogging system going? Oh, it's died. Nobody had time to use it. And I said, well, did you use it? No, I didn't. I was way too busy, you know? Well, no wonder the thing stopped or died. And likewise, you know, I was just showing some of the models with the technology that I love and I love playing with. I think everybody should be using that and showing how to use that and being enthusiastic about using that. So you model behaviour change and people follow you. And then that grows into an attitude change where you just can't take some certain things seriously because it just seems so counterintuitive and so against the way things are going. And that will happen to you before it happens to anybody else. So again, it's back around that thingification. If you're talking about these changes but are acting in ways that are incongruent with what you're talking about, nobody's going to follow you. Nobody's going to change at all. And that calls for leadership. And again, you know, leaders exist at all levels, all areas of organizations. And it's that opportunity that I think with each other will be what allows us to stay ahead of the robots and keep ahead of all this stuff. And the reason I've said collaboration with a small c is collaboration definitely suffered from thingification. You know, all these bits of software that suddenly had collaboration software slapped on them. So I always remember Billy Connolly he was in a music class at school, a music appreciation class. And he's not paying attention, he's staring out the window. The teacher came up and smacks him in the back of the head and said, appreciate Connolly, appreciate. And I've always thought it's a bit like that with collaboration. You know, you're sitting there in your office doing stuff, and some manager comes up and says, collaborate, collaborate. What does that look like? How do I do it? But with a small c, that's about reaching out to your own network to your own group of people who you trust, who you're comfortable with, who you will feel vulnerable with and have a decent conversation with. And because it does, if I ever get around to writing another book, I'm going to call it Changing Your World One Conversation at a Time. Because I think we've got into a position where we sort of go numb in the face of the scale of change that we're faced with, both societally, things that are happening like Brexit and Trump and whatever else, it's just so massive, and the polarization of the online networks, whatever. But actually, my last book had a chapter called We've All Got a Volume Control and Mob Rule. So we all have in that a partly innocuous power of what we decide to share or like or tweet about. We get to choose what flames we fan, what fires we try to put out, what changes we want to bring about. And I remember at the BBC, suddenly dawning on me that the only reason it ended up the way it did was because John Burt said it often enough and to enough people. And if you wanted it to be different, you had to do the same. You had to keep having those conversations, and you had to keep having the courage to open up and talk about the function of training in an organisation, or talk about the business needs of your organisation. So I'm going to shut up at that point, and Steve, we're going to ask what you could do. Well, I'll let you do it.
Yeah, I think first, let's say thank you to Euan, shall we? Obviously, a lot to unpack there, and we're going to have a conversation, and you're going to join in with that conversation.
You are going to join in with that.
Because I think it's important that we have all the voices in the room heard. But first, I'd like you to turn to the person next to you or someone near you and ask them or talk to them about what you've learned from this lesson or this session, and how it might apply to your professional practice, and we'll come back to you. So just take a few minutes to talk to the person next to you about that. Has anyone got anything significant that they want to share? Something they've learned, or a question that they've got, or some kind of issue that has arisen which they think, I hadn't thought of that before because of this session. Who wants to start? We've got 2 microphones in the room, and we want to pick them up on the video, obviously, so we'll use the microphones. Anyone want to start? Or are you all going to go blank on me? Sorry? Repeat the question. Really, what I'm asking you is what did you learn from this session that you can take away and apply, or what issues did you think were uncovered that you hadn't thought of before, or what questions have you got? And we can go any route on this, okay?
Or even for that matter, things you might disagree strongly with.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. If you want to make some argument. So we start here.
Hello, hi there, Euan. You're not someone I've come across before, so it was a pleasure to listen to you speak. I'm assuming as an interesting man, you have an equally interesting reason for getting your HGV license. Can you tell me a bit more that led you towards that?
I wasn't expecting that one. So it's not unrelated, actually. So there's a number of reasons. One was, as a freelancer, I have gaps. I'm lucky enough to get to speak around the world, but when I'm not doing that, I can be sitting at home thinking, what am I going to do? I like long distance driving, so I'm no stranger to doing 16, 17-hour drives, whatever. I've worked with Volvo over the years, and when they have a staff event, they park some of their state-of-the-art trucks in the foyer of the, and they're just gorgeous. These massive, big, clever things. And I mentioned it, but when I'm driving, I'm listening to podcasts and audiobooks, and I'm finding it a really high-quality thinking time, because it's almost, I don't know if you do this, it's almost like meditative. I just get into a rhythm. So the ideas that I'm dictating onto my watch are generally slightly higher quality than the normal, But it's also making it, you can get stuck in a bubble. And even though I'm peripheral to the corporate bubble, I was spending too much of my time connecting to that corporate bubble. So it's my own comfort zone that's being severely stretched. And I'll tell you some stories afterwards.
Is there anyone else that wants to say anything? Well, I've got the forest of hands now, so we'll come to this gentleman.
Another anecdote, because when I did my training, it was in East London, Edmonton. And there's this little office that I turned up to, and it's just in the middle of this busy high street. And I thought, where's the trucks? How can they do training here? And as I'm sitting there filling the forms in, this guy came in who I thought was a road sweeper, coming in to just say hello or whatever in his high-vis jacket. But no, that was Jack. That was my trainer. He was in his 70s, Turkish Cypriot, and between his inability after 30 years to speak the English language and my Scottish accent, we had communication challenges. But I genuinely ended up loving Jack because of his willingness and desire to help me do this really. And he made no fuss about me being some poncy middle-class office type person coming into his world. He just truly, truly helped me. Oh, I'm going to tear up talking about it because just in a way that I just thought, wow. You know, and again, we make all these assumptions about whose value, relative value, if you think. And there he was in a training situation, in an intimate, scary situation for me, making such a difference.
Gentleman in front here. Fire away. Got a microphone, have you?
That's behind you.
Oh, it's behind, sorry.
Thank you. If you'd ask me what I take from this session, it's, for me, compared to the opening session this morning, this one is slightly more philosophical. Mm-hmm. What I take from it is it's about redefining ourselves. It's not about technology. It's there. It's a thing. It's ahead of us. So the only way to deal with it, for me, from this speak, is redefining our connections, redefining ourselves, yes. The way we interact. Yes, that's what I learned.
I'm glad that's what you've taken from it, because that was the intention. That it's an opportunity to rediscover things that we've sort of
How about
lost.
Euan, can I ask you, how will that actually work in practice then? And what role does the L&D professional have in encouraging that to happen? Because it's easier said than done, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. So I took part in a local radio show that a friend of mine does, which is also a podcast, with the former director of the BBC's HR department, Lucy Adams. And in the conversation when I talked about my lifestyle and the way I use technology, she said, you're not normal. You're not, other people aren't like you. But then in the same conversation, she began to convince herself that actually when she thought about it, she knew a lot of people who are beginning to work like this and who are beginning to think like this and being able to take these opportunities. So I don't think, and I was saying earlier to Steve, I have to be careful. I am aware that the BBC was not a normal organisation. We had lots of opportunities to be more autonomous and creative and thoughtful than it might be the case in some other institutions that some of you may work for. So I'm very aware that the wriggle room varies hugely from organisation to organisation. But back to my point about one conversation at a time, it's not inevitable that it stays that way. Because if you're feeling uneasy about what's happening, other people around you will be feeling uneasy. And that's why I mentioned the word leadership, because leadership is involved in just making that first instigation and kicking off that conversation, and then things start to change.
Can we take a straw poll in the room here? Is my microphone on? Can we take a straw poll? On the basis of what we've been talking about, in your organisation, put your hand up if you think there are roadblocks to transformation through digital media. So that's a few of you. That's not even 50%. That's about a third of you. That's interesting.
Does that assume that the other 2/3 don't have any roadblocks?
That's what I'm thinking.
Because I'd be sceptical.
Yeah, that is interesting. So those of you who didn't put your hands up, you think that the road is smooth for that kind of approach?
Smoothing out.
Or smoothing out, maybe. So, well, it's a process, obviously. Interesting.
Yeah, so again, it's interesting about businesses and institutions and the type of organisations you work for. I know particularly the financial sector are desperately trying to keep up with this, with digital transformation. And they've got the same sort of existential crisis. What are we here for? What value are we adding? If it's just adding sums up, then we're in trouble. But if we've got real perspective or other avenues of adding value, then we're okay. But again, that's a shift around in terms of how they've seen themselves.
We have a question at the back here. The guy with the white shirt.
Yeah, thank you. I think is that working?
You're on.
Yeah.
Yep.
Thank you for your speech. Brilliant. Made me think a hell of a lot, to be honest. More than I was expecting. My question to you.
Recover.
My question to you is working collaboratively with digital and then working alongside, say, the face-to-face training side. So the first question is, how do you feel that's going to go, and is that going to be more adopted, so like the blended approach? And secondly, looking further afield, when do you think this wall is going to hit where people aren't so in bed with digital currently and not embracing it? Do you see there's going to be a point where you're going to have to go digital and it's too late coming to the party?
Interesting. So the first question, again, I don't feel or see the demarcations quite so clearly. So in the sense that, I've often said I've only got so much face-to-face time left on the planet, and investing in social networks has made it more likely I spend that wisely and to good effect. So you can use one to reinforce and help the other. And even in the context at work at the BBC, people who used our internal social network, Talk Gateway, we would turn up for meetings and we knew the backstory. We knew what the issues people were dealing with were. We even knew where they were going on holiday and how the wife and kids were. And we had to stand and wait while the analog half of the room went through that old ritual. And again, you begin to see these two-speed worlds that become obvious to people. So I think making better use of the tools to enhance your real valuable face-to-face time, or making sure that it is the good face-to-face and not the waste of time face-to-face, is a real value. In terms of timescales, I'm not a futurist. I mean, I stood up in Dublin last week with a guy who calls himself a futurist, and it's a dodgy game, especially when you try to put numbers on things. Yeah. And it's going to sound completely both faster than you expect and slower than you expect. It's just knowing which bits. Some things are already here. I get depressed sometimes when I talk to people in business and they don't even know what we're all doing quite happily out on the internet. And as I say, there's that slight snobbishness of why I don't do technology, especially at senior people levels. So there's that. So it's kind of already happening in some senses. In terms of the consequences, this whole thing about too big to fail, I think there are whole sectors that could really, really disappear quite quickly. Because on the internet, in terms of banking, my only experience of my bank is through their internet interface, which with most of my banks is truly atrocious. And as was the case with Monzo, I was just one click away. Once I realized how much better things could be, boom, I was off. You have that happen to enough million customers because we've all talked to each other on a social network about how cracking Monzo is, and the next thing your business is in trouble. Because again, corporates have no idea how to deal with this. Some of my work is helping them try to engage online with customers. And they've got one hand stuck in their ear and the other hand trying to hold them back,
Okay, we have a question over here and near the back.
Yeah, you mentioned cultural change and simplification, you having some thinking time whilst driving.
Yep.
With your experience, what are the very best doing to bring about such change? Can you give me tips or advice from all the companies you've seen? What are the very best doing?
I shouldn't do this.
You said you wouldn't, didn't you?
No, it's just I was doing a thing in Washington about knowledge management, and I got asked that first question about have you any good examples of organisations that are doing this really well? And I'm afraid I said, oh, for goodness sake, stop reading case study porn and get on with it. In the sense that we tend to use it as a displacement activity. I just need to find somebody else who's done it. There's very few, but that doesn't mean it's not the right thing to do. And so I think if you don't care enough about this to begin to do it yourselves, you're probably on a sticky wicket anyway. Clearly, well, okay, so to be fair to your question, there are startup companies. It's easier with a startup. But a friend of mine is the managing director of Xero, the online accounting firm. And they're really interesting because Gary is a blogging friend I've known for 18 years. He gets it. He's been great. Atlassian are the same. In Sydney, we were the first customers for their wiki, Confluence. Both organisations have been immersed in this connected network, digital way of world from the start. But they're getting to a size where they're both beginning to think, hang on, how do we do this? They're starting to accrete normal managers who behave like normal managers and start to make people behave and fit to the rules and stuff like that. So I think it's really interesting, that scale-up stage as it's becoming known, how they make that transition. I'm more sceptical about the big ones that are buying up startups, trying to emulate, growing beards as fast as they can, trying to get at the hipsters. And it does sometimes feel like I'm spending my career trying to resuscitate dinosaurs, and it might be kinder just to shoot them. So if you're working for one of those dinosaurs, euthanasia is always a... Sorry.
Okay.
So
I said I shouldn't go there.
You talked about shadow learning, and
Yeah.
I wrote here, learning without the consent of formal structures.
Yes.
If you really think about it, learning and development is a formal structure.
You're like
Command and
university in
control.
my example, yes.
How do we migrate to the more shadow learning approach? You're right, absolutely. If I think about how I learn, I'll go to YouTube and I'll figure out how to change a washer from there. I won't ask someone first until I fail.
Yeah. And you're right, and the systems are very clunky at the moment. Have you been on the course? Well, yes, but it doesn't mean I've learned anything. Or on the e-learning system, have you clicked through certain numbers of steps? Well, likewise, that doesn't mean I've understood or learned. It's a bit like the work thing. Just because you turn up for work doesn't mean you're adding value. So again, that's part of the shift of mindset. Are they evidencing knowing more? Are they more competent? Have they taken steps to enhance their, and I'm not saying I know all the answers to how you might do this, but I think it has to be oriented that way. Or not. So I tweeted the other day, that thing about 10,000 hours leads to mastery. I said, many cab drivers clearly prove that's bollocks. It fascinates me how they can spend their lives driving around and still be so bad at it. So it's measuring outputs, not inputs, I think, is a general shift. And again, it's uncomfortable, because how do you measure someone? So we all do it the easy ways, but we actually don't measure anything.
Question I'm interested in, Euan, is when an organisation, maybe a large or medium-sized organisation, does start to digitally transform, where does it start? At what point? Does it start in L&D or does it start somewhere else, from your experience?
I wouldn't expect so. I think, so again, just going down to Australia to do some work with some boards there, because they ought to be leading it.
Yeah.
But likewise, they're all mulling around thinking, what the hell does digital mean? And so it's staggered me how often when you try to probe into what people think their organisation does, even at the top, how hard they find it. And until you can encapsulate clearly what you do, digitising it, you're just going to digitise the mess rather than making it better. So again, I think that might be a role for learning and development people, just to have that methodology, those provocative, eye-opening questions and ways of making the senior people, because nobody else is going to do it, because they're all part of the silos, they're all part of the system. So that's why I think the flag of learning is broad enough and idealistic enough, if you like, to be an opportunity. I
was intrigued by your statement about, we can sit down if you like. I was intrigued by your statement where you mentioned digital transformation being about unleashing human capabilities and skills.
Yep.
And who else thought that was rather interesting? Anyone else did that gain some traction with you? I see that you tweeted out, didn't you, as well? What does that look like?
So so somebody at that breakfast the other day was talking about marketing and using marketing techniques for training. It brought me out in hives, because, going back to the social media thing, that went wrong because of marketing manipulation, even down to Facebook algorithms or whatever else, and it's about intent. Because for me, the internet was fascinating because it was, having been a professional storyteller, it was taking back our own storytelling. It was making our own sense of the world and having a mechanism to share it. So the internet for me was all about unleashing. But it became assimilated. It got sucked into the old game because they saw the power in it. They saw the disruptive power in it.
I guess a lot of that is rather human, because it's about narratives, it's about storytelling, isn't it?
Yep.
It's about sharing experiences. Is that the kind of route that you see digital going down?
Yes.
I mean, social media has a huge role to play in that.
Yes, totally.
Yeah.
And it is, because we were talking about this earlier,
yeah.
And back to the cognitive science, neuroscience, whatever else, the way we make sense of the world, the narrativization that our brains are developed for, we can't help ourselves, even if the stories are painful. And also manipulable. Hitler told some bloody good stories. So again, I think it comes down to intent.
It's an interesting question, and I'd like you all to maybe think about this in your own role. What role does storytelling actually have in your organisation? Is there a role for it? Have you seen that in action, or maybe not? Is there a place for it? Is there a roadblock that stops that from happening? It's an interesting question, and
just to pick up on it, because for me, again, blogging for me is memos to self.
Yeah.
So it's me telling me stories to myself about something that I've noticed, that hopefully have some value for other people. They can pick up, oh yeah, I noticed that. So I call it the ooh, that's interesting principle. So I'll filter the world in terms of what's interesting enough. I go, oh, that's interesting, I might write about that. And then if I've done a half-decent job, other people go, oh, that is interesting, I didn't know that. And it migrates and propagates. And you learn the ability to condense the essence of that insight or that learning into, for me, an optimal 3-paragraph long blog post or 140 characters on Twitter. And that aspiration to concision, as opposed to 40-page reports that nobody ever bloody reads, is I think, again, a skill. I'd love to get into teaching people how to write, talk about transformation, transform business communication, and get away from pre-formatted templates that you spend half your life faffing around with trying to make look good, but don't say anything.
So maybe the answer to that first question I asked about, where does it start? Maybe the answer is it's in the communication aspects of a company that it probably starts if it's going to catch on.
Well, it starts with the next conversation.
Yeah.
Seriously, it's deceptively easy.
We are running out of time. Time is always the enemy of events like this, but I have one final question to ask you, and I suppose it's an open-ended question, and it will probably take us to the finish, and it's this, it's in 2 parts. Firstly, are there organizations, do you think, that will never digitally transform but survive? And what happens if an organization does not digitally transform? It's the same question, I think. No, I've got you.
So both of my daughters look like going into the theatre, one in musical theatre, one in drama. She's writing dramas, whatever. And I've said to both of them, smart move, because when all the white-collar knowledge workers are sitting at home with loads of time to fill, they'll need entertained. But I'm also aware that there are already, so Amazon, for instance, with the Kindle, have a vast, vast library of romance or, the sort of more easily written genres, if you like. And they're just a hair's breadth away from being able to click a button. We've run out of a particular genre. Let's get the bots to write the next Harry Potter or whatever. I do believe that's possible. Yeah. So even that creative human job, I'm not sure.
Are we perhaps looking at human characteristics that are inalienably human? There's no way that perhaps AI could actually emulate them.
Well, so this is why I'm reading so much about consciousness. And they call it the hard problem. Is consciousness just the result of having a complex enough system, and it suddenly just happens that you've got consciousness? But it's not the case. And I don't want to live in a materialist, reductionist, everything's mechanical, we understand it all world. Not least because that gives the opportunity for misuse and abuse to very small groups of people, as I said earlier. So I like messiness, I like humanness, it's part of why I climb mountains, to scare myself witless, it's to make myself feel real, as opposed to this disembodied sitting watching yet another bloody screen at night kind of a world. So whatever that thing is, more of that.
I think Gerd Leonard says this in his last book. I think it's called Machine versus Human. Do you know the book? Gerd's spoken here at least on 2 occasions before. He mentions that idea that we have to find out what it is that makes us human and then capitalize on that, because that's going to keep us.
That's our USP.
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
Right.
Yeah. It'll save us from the robots.
That's right.
And on that note, or as I say, on that bombshell, as Jeremy Clarkson used to say.
Don't mention Jeremy Clarkson at the end of my...
I didn't mention him, right. He's not one of my heroes, by the way. But
it was all going so well up to that point.
On that note, I'd like us all to thank Euan once again for a wonderful session. Thank you, Euan.
Thank you.